Danjin is a danger. To you, your enemies, and perhaps most importantly of all, herself. She's one of the highest damaging characters in the game that can take on a variety of different roles across her teams, and she does all of this while being a 4-star, but all of her performance comes at a very high price. With that, welcome back to the second episode in my new series, where I'll be raising underused or off-meta characters to the max level, or close to it at the very least, to see whether or not they're worth your investment, be it your materials or your pulls. While Danjin is a popular character, after the release of so many different limited DPSs, a lot of the player base has moved on to safer, more reliable options, and there are still some people who don't know about her full potential. Danjin, with her baseline kit, provides a massive amount of pure, raw damage and an incredible amount of concerto energy generation. Her resonance skill is what makes it all happen. This ability has no cooldown and has 3 different attacks that build off her basic attack chain, which has 3 stages. Using her resonance skill at a baseline or after her first attack will do a single slash called Carmine Gleam that can be followed up by the second and third hits of her basic attack chain. When used after her second basic attack or a dodge counter, her resonance skill Crimson Erosion can be activated 2 times in a row, with the second hit applying a unique debuff called Incinerating Will that gives her a 20% damage buff against affected targets. After her third basic attack, her third combo, Sanguine Pulse, can be activated 3 times, dealing the most overall damage. Every hit of these attacks consumes 3% of Danjin's HP, even if they don't land on the target, and attacks that deal multiple instances of damage, like the third hit of her third combo, will consume HP for every hit. This seems like an awful trade at first, but Danjin makes up for this with her Forte circuit. The circuit builds up every time Danjin inflicts damage to herself, and when it reaches 50% or above, she gains access to a unique heavy attack called Chaos Cleave, and a follow-up attack Scatter Bloom that deals a massive amount of damage. This damage more than doubles when Danjin has 100% of her Forte circuit, and all of these enhanced attacks will heal her for 36% of her health. This attack, regardless of its charge, also generates an insane amount of concerto energy. Her Liberation just deals a large amount of damage with a very low cooldown and resonance energy cost, and also has the bonus of freezing time during its animation. Factoring in all of her abilities, Danjin's optimal playstyle centers around inflicting the Incinerating Will debuff through her second resonance skill combo, which can also be used immediately after her intro skill, and then from there, following up with as many Sanguine Pulses and dodge counter follow-ups as possible to build up her Forte circuit. If you're playing Danjin as a main DPS, you'll typically want to build up a full circuit to unleash a maximum damage Chaos Cleave on her enemies. However, if you're looking to play Danjin as a sub-DPS buffer for a character like Havoc Rover, building up her circuit to 50% and using her enhanced heavy attack will oftentimes give you a full concerto gauge, making her rotations one of the fastest in the game, with very quick access to her outro skill that buffs the incoming resonator with a 23% Havoc damage amplification. Danjin also comes equipped with powerful inherent skills. Her first inherent buffs the damage of her Crimson Erosion combo when used after a dodge counter, and also doubles the HP cost and Forte circuit buildup of that move, making it one of the fastest ways to generate that energy. Her second inherent grants her a 20% heavy attack buff for 5 seconds after using her Sanguine Pulse combo, synergizing very well with her Forte circuit. Her Ascension stats are also typical for a 4-star character, with boosts to Havoc attribute damage and buffs to attack, lacking the very helpful critical stats that we typically see on 5-star characters. When building Danjin, you want to prioritize her Forte circuit, then her Resonance skill, and then her Resonance Liberation. Her basic attack is used very often to begin and continue her combos. The actual damage from these attacks aren't a significant part of her rotations, so this ability and her intro skill can be kept lower if you're trying to save resources without sacrificing too much performance. For her weapons, Danjin has fantastic options. For the 4 stars, the new Endless Collapse will be her best choice, as its high base attack and built-in energy regen on using a resonance skill gives her incredible uptime on her liberation without sacrificing damage. Other 4-star options like Commando of Conviction and Lunar Cutter will also get the job done, and will outperform Endless Collapse if you've got a lot of copies. Overture, the Concerto energy weapon, is almost completely useless on Danjin, as her insane Concerto generation on her Forte circuit makes the weapon effect and its low base stats very redundant. For 5-star options, Emerald of Genesis will be Danjin's most accessible and second best option. She can easily stack up the weapon's full effect as her resonance skill has no cooldown, and the weapon's energy regen and amazing base stats make it a fantastic stat stick for her kit. Blazing Brilliance, Xiangli's signature, is the ideal weapon if you want to play Danjin as a main DPS or a dual DPS. Its incredible boost to resonance skill damage heavily benefit a large part of her profile. When it comes to her echoes, Danjin has a lot of great options. If played as a main DPS, the Havoc set works fantastically on her, as she has to use basic attacks to begin her combo and apply her Incinerating Will debuff and second inherent skill buff before doing a majority of her damage through her Liberation and Forte circuit. When it comes to Havoc forecasts, Danjin works well with both Crownless and Dreamless, with Dreamless much more effective for quick swap rotations with a dual DPS, while Crownless can be cancelled while still retaining its full buffs to resonance skill and Havoc damage for faster rotations. However, for simplicity's sake, I recommend just running Dreamless. This means you can also slot her on Moonlit Clouds, especially if you're pairing her with a Havoc DPS like Rover to fully capitalize on her buffing potential. She also has massive synergy with the Impermanence Heron's attack, as it deals entirely Havoc damage. For the most adventurous players of all, Danjin can also be ran on the Rejuvenating Glow set given her self-healing on her Forte Enhanced Heavy attack. But she won't be keeping anybody else on your team alive, so keep that in mind. Aside from her Sonata set, you'll want as many crit rate, crit damage, energy regen, and attack subs as possible, with heavy attack, resonance skill, and liberation damage bonuses as the cherry on top. Danjin scales very well with crit, especially as you unlock more of her sequence nodes, as there's one that gives her a 15% crit rate bonus when she has more than 50% of her Forte circuit. For most players building her, Moonlit Clouds will be the most accessible set, as you likely have a lot of reusable pieces, with the main requirement being Havoc damage 3 costs. As you can see, my Danjin is at a decent level of investment and also at S6. I tested her performance across quite a few teams with both a sub DPS and main DPS Echo set, and the results were pretty damn good. Danjin can function very well even if there isn't a good recipient for her outro skill, as long as you focus entirely on her role as a main DPS. With my echoes and crit ratio looking a bit rough, I'll be slotting Shorekeeper into all of her lineups. First team up is with Mortefi, and this team is easily one of the most affordable in the game with 2 4-stars. This team follows a traditional hypercarry rotation that starts off the rotation by filling Danjin's Forte circuit. You then just cycle through your outro skills, starting with your support, then sub DPS, or coming on field with Danjin's intro and following up with Crimson Erosion to apply the Incinerating Will debuff to enemies. Before using Danjin's Forte circuit, ensure that you use Sanguine Pulse at least once for its 30% heavy attack buff, and if you're at S5 or above, below 60% health as well to maximize her damage buffs. Danjin's ultimate can be used freely after applying Incinerating Will, but only at S0. With later nodes like her S5 and S6, you want to save her ultimate for after these attack and Havoc buffs are enabled for maximum damage. You can decide whether or not to use Chaos Cleave early at S6 to give your Mortefi this attack buff as well for his coordinated attacks. With Mortefi's outro buff to heavy attack, Danjin's maxed out Forte attack ends up dealing a massive amount of damage, and Dreamless is fantastic as an outro skill replacement used at the end of Danjin's combo before swapping back to your support to start a new rotation. You can think of this team as a far more dangerous and risky version of Jian. The team overall is very powerful, but doesn't have any recipients for Danjin's outro buff. Our next lineup features more of our premium sub DPS characters, starting with Yinlin. This team is again going to follow a traditional hypercarry rotation with a similar start of building Danjin's Forte circuit. There's nothing too particularly crazy about the setup here, other than the fact that Yinlin Yinlin takes a bit longer than Mortefi in single target to build up Concerto. Depending on Danjin's sequence nodes, you might want to activate Chaos Cleave early to give Yinlin the attack buff at S6 for her coordinated attacks. Yinlin's outro skill buffs Resonance Liberation damage, so you want to ensure that you have Danjin's S6 buff active if available, as well as all of her other sequence node effects before using this attack to maximize the damage. You could also play this team with a quick swap playstyle if you slot Yinlin on Void Thunder, but Moonlit Clouds is the best option to maximize Danjin's damage. Like with Mortefi, this team also really doesn't have a use for Danjin's outro skill. Our next team features another limited sub DPS, Zhezhi. Like the previous two lineups, this team starts with the same traditional hypercarry rotation. Zhezhi has one of the fastest rotations in the game, and her outro buff's focus on resonance skills is quite significant to Danjin's overall damage. Early Chaos Cleaves are another great option here to buff Zhezhi's coordinated attacks. Zhezhi also doesn't have a lot of quick swap potential, so a Moonlit Cloud set to maximize Danjin's damage is the best overall pick. The team in general is very powerful, but again, like the other two, doesn't have any recipient for Danjin's outro buff. Our fourth team is a bit more creative, a dual DPS lineup with Xiangli Yao. Unlike the previous three teams, this team constantly swaps between the two DPS characters to maximize our damage. Xiangli's built-in time slow and very good quick swap windows allows for a ton of synergy with Danjin, who desperately wants to avoid hits and stay at low health to maximize damage. You'll want to activate Chaos Cleave ASAP with S6 to apply the attack buff to the secondary DPS. Dreamless is easily the best echo skill within these lineups, as its long animation time isn't a concern when quick swapped. This team is also one of the most fun to play in the game, but unfortunately still doesn't have any recipient for Danjin's outro skill. Our last team, however, does, and it's the classic Rover hypercarry team with Danjin as the sub DPS. This team is unfortunately very hard to gear if you don't have multiple 5-star swords, as Danjin and Rover are both sword wielders. This means I used a maxed out Endless Collapse on Danjin, who was also slotted on the Moonlit Cloud set to maximize her buffing potential. This team heavily focuses on spamming as many Chaos Cleaves as possible for its insane Concerto generation, and at S6, massive attack buff to the team. Danjin has some of the fastest rotations in the game, especially when paired with the Heron's energy regeneration. Chaos Cleave and her ultimate alone will fill up to 80% of her Concerto gauge, giving you almost permanent uptime on Moonlit Clouds and Danjin's outro buff on Rover. The end result is a lot of damage, without a lot of risk to Danjin herself, as there's no need to dip her health into dangerous territories to actually deal damage. It's just some other character on the team doing it. This is the safest and easiest way to play Danjin while still getting fantastic results. And if you're tired of watching her KO animation, like I was while getting all of this footage, this is a great way to play her. However, it's also perfectly viable to play this comp with a dual DPS focus as well, using all of the tips and advice you've seen on the Xiangli Yao section. Now that we've taken a look at some of her teams, it's time to talk about her overall value and power. Danjin's main strength is her massive damage and extremely fast Concerto energy generation. With proper setup, she has one of the fastest rotations in the game, but there's unfortunately very few eligible recipients for her outro buff, as there are quite literally only 3 Havoc characters in the game, and one of them is a support. While she does succeed in dual DPS lineups, it's very hard to make full use of her kit, as there's only one other Havoc DPS, but that can easily change in the future. However, Dreamless can serve as a pseudo outro skill due to its amazing swap canceling potential. And with all the personal damage buffs she has across her sequence nodes, she's not missing the minor buffs on most 4-cost echoes. Her first sequence node grants her a stacking attack buff that caps out at 30% whenever she attacks an enemy with the Incinerating Will debuff. Her second buffs all damage against incinerated targets by 20%. Her third is a simple damage buff to her Resonance Liberation, and her fourth gives her a huge 15% crit rate buff as long as her Forte circuit is above half, which is unfortunately lost after the attack. Her fifth gives her a Havoc damage bonus that gets doubled whenever she's below 60% health, meaning you want to save her big bursts on her Forte and Liberation until this becomes fully active. Her sixth node, like many other 4-star characters, is easily her best, granting granting a massive attack boost to the entire team after using any kind of Chaos Cleave. When combined with Moonlit Clouds, this turns her into an attack buffer that gives 42.5% attack to a main DPS that also isn't lost when swapping off field, and it turns her into a very flexible sub DPS that has the most potential with Rover. At the end of the day, Danjin does a lot of damage and gains a huge amount of flexibility due to her insane concerto generation as she gets her final sequence node. She deals a lot of damage at a baseline and entirely by herself. That's what allows her to solo so much content in the game. It all comes at the cost of living on the edge almost every second you play her as a main DPS. If you're tired of resetting, give her sub DPS role a try. We'll be expanding the teams and compositions as this series grows and I get more and more characters built, so be on the lookout for more in-depth overviews like this in the future. As always, if you enjoyed this content, please hit that like and subscribe button. Peace out.